February 17, 1943, Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine. On a windswept airfield in the Ukrainian steppe, a group of anxious staff officers is hustling a single man across the tarmac. They are moving fast, close to a run. The man does not look like someone who is winning a war. That man is Adolf Hitler, Führer of the Third Reich. Somewhere to the northeast, roughly 30 kilometers from where he is standing, Soviet tank columns are driving directly toward this airfield. As the German general in whose headquarters Hitler had been staying would later write, "There was not a single formation between us and the enemy, nothing at all." The Soviet commanders had no idea Hitler was there. They had no conception of how close they came to ending the war that afternoon. How did it get to this point? 3 weeks earlier, on February 2nd, 1943, the last organized remnants of the German Sixth Army laid down their weapons in the rubble of Stalingrad. Around 90,000 men walked into Soviet captivity. Their commander, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, promoted to that rank by Hitler just 2 days before, had received an unmistakable instruction with that promotion: die rather than surrender, since no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. He ignored the implied order and gave himself up. His final radio message to Hitler had come 9 days before the surrender. No strategic assessment, no request for reinforcement, just the cold arithmetic of collapse. Troops without ammunition or food. Effective command no longer possible. 18,000 wounded without any supplies, dressings, or drugs. Further resistance pointless. Collapse unavoidable. After his capture, Paulus explained himself to Soviet interrogators with a soldier's practiced detachment. "Soldiers fight," he told them, "carrying out their duty, not thinking about the reasons. The beginning and the end of war is the business of politicians." He had done his job. The politicians had done theirs. But the fall of the Sixth Army was not an isolated disaster. It was the most visible rupture in a front that was tearing itself apart along its entire length. By January 1943, the Wehrmacht was running approximately 470,000 men below full strength on the Eastern Front. Of the roughly 3,300 tanks Germany had launched into the Soviet Union, with just 495 remained operational. Mostly older models strung across a front measuring thousands of kilometers. The Hungarian Second Army and the Italian Eighth Army, positioned along the Don, had been shattered by Soviet attacks that winter, leaving gaps that no one had the forces to close. From the ranks, something rawer than operational analysis was rising to the surface. A captured private named Franz Hübner of the 131st Infantry Regiment had been found carrying a Soviet leaflet and a verdict: "Let the generals fight the war themselves." He was sick of it. He had had his fill, and he was not alone. The destruction of the Sixth Army had cost Germany more than just an army. It had cost something harder to measure and impossible to replace. The one man in the German command who appeared to grasp both the full scale of the crisis and the specific possibility of surviving it was a 55-year-old Prussian aristocrat with silver hair and an imperious manner, currently directing what remained of Germany's southern forces from a headquarters in Zaporizhzhia. Erich von Manstein, commander of Army Group Don, soon to be redesignated Army Group South, and by the consensus of his peers, including his enemies, the finest operational mind in the Wehrmacht. He had designed the sickle cut through the Ardennes that destroyed France in 40 days. Sevastopol fell to his siege in 1942. In November of that year, when Hitler and his staff began to grasp the scale of what was coming, Manstein was pulled from the Leningrad front and handed command of a formation that existed mainly on paper. What Manstein believed, and what made him dangerous to fight and difficult to work for, was a doctrine his superiors found almost physically uncomfortable: mobile defense, yield ground to preserve forces, and let the enemy advance. Let their flanks grow long, their supply lines thin out, their fuel gauges drop toward empty. Then, when their momentum has spent itself and they are strung out across hundreds of kilometers of steppe, strike, not at their front, but at their flanks, their rear, the unguarded space between their spearheads. He called it the backhand blow, and he explained it in the language of chess, specifically the castling maneuver, where a king and rook exchange positions to improve the board. Move the pieces before the opponent understands where they are going. It sounds elegant. In practice, it demands something most commanders cannot sustain: the nerve to watch cities fall, to answer political screaming with operational patience, and to trust that the trap will close before the army does. Manstein's memoir, Lost Victories, published in 1955, is one of the most consequential military documents of the 20th century, and one of the most self-serving. He dismissed rivals, claimed credit for victories, and distributed blame for defeats with the precision of a man who had spent years constructing his own reputation. Many historians have called it unreliable and apologetic. His is the most documented voice in this record, but it is the voice of a man building his own legend. The gap between the operational commander and the post-war myth-maker is, in itself, a story worth telling. What the Soviet commanders knew in late January and early February of 1943 came down to this: they had just destroyed the largest and best-equipped German army on the Eastern Front. The momentum of Stalingrad was theirs to spend, and the evidence in front of them: German columns moving west, forward positions abandoned, equipment left behind, air bases evacuated, confirmed what their intelligence was already telling them. The Wehrmacht had no reserves. It was pulling back behind the Dnieper. On January 29th, General Alexei Morozov launched Operation Gallop, driving toward Luhansk, then Donetsk, then the Sea of Azov. On his right, General Dmitry Sorokin pressed Operation Star toward Kharkov. Between the two operations, Soviet armor was covering ground at a pace that seemed, from the Soviet side, to confirm everything they believed about the German collapse. Kursk fell on February 8th, Luhansk on the 14th. The force Morozov was most confident in was Mobile Group Popov, a spearhead designed to drive 270 kilometers in a single lunge toward the Dnieper crossings. The most successful Soviet armored operations during Stalingrad had advanced 100 to 120 kilometers in a single thrust, roughly as far as a T-34 could travel cross-country on one tank of fuel. Popov's group was being asked to go more than twice that distance. General Polo Yarov's 4th Guards Tank Corps had begun Operation Gallop with 40 tanks. Most formations were at a third of their authorized strength, but the road west kept opening and the German positions kept emptying, and the commanders pushed forward with the certainty of men whose intelligence confirmed what they had just watched happen at Stalingrad. What Morozov's intelligence did not know, could not know because the information had not reached them, was that 3 elite Waffen-SS Panzer divisions had been transferred east from France. Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, Das Reich, Totenkopf. The 3 best equipped divisions in the German order of battle, freshly refitted, moving into position on Manstein's left flank. The columns Soviet reconnaissance was tracking were not a broken army in flight. They were pieces being repositioned on a board. The Soviet commanders were right that something dramatic was happening. They had the cause completely backwards. Manstein's castling maneuver had required 2 months of preparation, 2 months of argument with Hitler, and the kind of operational nerve that most commanders spend their careers avoiding. The critical piece was the Caucasus, Army Group A. Hundreds of thousands of men had spent the autumn driving south toward Baku's oil fields. When the Stalingrad encirclement formed, they risked being cut off entirely. Only after a month of methodical argument by Chief of the General Staff, Hans Mertens, quietly persistent, wearing down Hitler's resistance with the patience of a man who understood he could not win a direct confrontation, did the Führer authorize the withdrawal. Without it, Germany might have lost 2 field armies in the same winter. That withdrawal freed the 1st Panzer Army to move north. The SS Panzer Corps arriving from France slotted into the line. The 4th Air Fleet under Otto Freiwald reorganized and tripled its daily sortie rate from 350 missions in January to 1,000 in February, restoring German air superiority over the critical sector. The trap was being set, and every German soldier moving west, every abandoned position, every vehicle column that Soviet reconnaissance spotted was being read in Morozov's headquarters as confirmation of the route they were pursuing. Then came February 13th. Hitler ordered Kharkov held at all costs. On February 15th, SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Walter, 62 years old, glass eye, beloved by the men of his corps, ordered the city evacuated. Soviet forces entered on the 16th. The city Hitler had demanded be held to the last man was now in Soviet hands, and the officer who had surrendered it was the very man Manstein was counting on to execute the decisive blow. A man now watching a major city fall while assuring the Führer that this was part of the plan. That was the operational price of Manstein's strategy, and it was a price Hitler could barely stand to pay. Every lost city meant another negotiation. Every negotiation narrowed the margin of trust. February 17th, Zaporizhzhia airfield. Hitler arrives at Manstein's headquarters to approve the counteroffensive. The meetings run across 3 days. The argument is the same one Manstein has been making for weeks. The Russians are worn out. They are far from their supply dumps. Their fuel is nearly gone. Strike now. And while those conversations are happening, look into the operations room, where the maps are spread out and the position markers are being moved. Manstein's staff receives a report. Soviet tank columns. What remains of Popov's mobile group, approximately 50 working tanks, fuel critically low, has closed to within striking distance of the Dnieper crossings, within 30 kilometers of this airfield. By noon, the Führer of the Third Reich is on a plane. Staff officers prepare the headquarters for close-range defense. Soviet forces are an hour away, and the most important German command post on the Eastern Front stands between nothing and them. The Soviets do not know Hitler is there. They are racing toward what they believe are the Dnieper crossings, reading every kilometer of open steppe as proof of the route they are pursuing. They are running on fumes, their communications beginning to fragment, their flanks open to forces they cannot see. The plane lifts off. On February 19th, the counterattack begins. Two converging thrusts. From the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army drives north into the Soviet flank. From the northwest, Walter's SS Panzer Corps swings down from the area of Pavlograd. The Soviet columns, strung out for hundreds of kilometers in road march, expecting to pursue a broken enemy, are hit simultaneously in front, on both flanks, and from the rear. War correspondent Vasily Grossman, moving with the Soviet advance that winter, had recorded the landscape, savage cold snow and freezing air that iced up the nostrils. Frozen Germans lying stiff along the roads in thin tunics like paper, killed not by Soviet bullets, but by a winter they had not prepared for. Now that same white steppe was filling with a different kind of evidence. Rolf Brenner watched from his command vehicle as smoke and flames rose from Russian tanks that had ground to a halt in the snow. Popov's mobile group, the force that had closed to within 30 kilometers of Hitler's chair, was surrounded and destroyed. 50 working tanks against the concentrated armor of 3 SS divisions. The formations Morozov had been urging forward were caught mid-stride. Their own momentum turned against them. The intelligence that told them the Germans had no reserves had not been wrong about what it saw. It had been catastrophically wrong about what it meant. By early March, the southern Soviet offensive had been shattered, around 80,000 Soviet casualties, more than 1,200 tanks lost. German losses were roughly a quarter of that. The trap had closed, but Walter's SS Corps was now moving on Kharkov. Manstein's stated intent had been encirclement. Seal the city, cut it off, reduce it without a frontal assault. A direct attack on a defended urban area costs more than it needs to and destroys what it takes. Hoth, commanding the 4th Panzer Army, gave Walter an order with room in it: seal off the city from the west and north and take any opportunity to seize it. What Walter heard, or chose to hear, was permission. On March 11th, he drove all 3 SS divisions directly into Kharkov. 4 days of house-to-house fighting, building to building, room to room, in a city already battered by 3 years of war. Leibstandarte, Das Reich, Totenkopf, the men who 6 weeks earlier had been ordered to hold this same city to the last, and whose commander had evacuated it rather than comply, now bled to retake it street by street. On March 15th, the SS flag rose over Kharkov. 2 days later, German forces retook Belgorod. The street fighting cost approximately 300 men of the SS Panzer Corps. Soviet losses in the preceding weeks in that sector numbered 46,000 dead and 14,000 prisoners. The question of whose decision the direct assault actually was, Manstein's plan, Hoth's ambiguous order, or Walter's independent judgment, possibly driven by something other than operational logic, was never formally resolved. Walter's post-war recognition was delayed. Some historians have suggested the delay was punishment for abandoning the city in February. The city he abandoned to save his corps, he then spent his corps to retake. That contradiction was never publicly aired. It remains unresolved. The castling maneuver, the backhand blow, the nerve to hold steady while cities fell, All of it was real, and the operational record supports it fully. There was a board, and there were pieces, and Manstein moved them with a precision that military historians still study. But the chess vocabulary does not show what the board was sitting on. In November 1941, Manstein issued an order of the day. It called Jews the spiritual bearers of Bolshevik terror and endorsed their persecution. Units under his command provided logistics and security for Einsatzgruppen operations, the mobile killing units moving through the occupied East, executing Jews, Soviet commissars, and anyone else designated for elimination. The commissar order requiring the summary execution of captured Soviet political officers was implemented under his command. What were described as anti-partisan operations were in significant part massacres of civilians. At headquarters level, this was not a secret. The Einsatzgruppen required German Army cooperation to function, transport, supplies, local intelligence, the standing aside of military authority to let the killing proceed. A field sergeant named Werner Salzburg wrote in his diary in November of that year, a diary later recovered in Soviet trophy archives, not as a confession, but as a statement of cold strategic logic. We killed thousands of Russians and Jews with wives and children around Kiev and Kharkov. If they win, he wrote, they will take revenge on us for everything we did. And therefore, it is for precisely this reason that we need to exert all our strength to win the war. Not a general, not a policy architect. A sergeant in a private diary who understood with complete clarity that the war of extermination being prosecuted in the occupied East and the military campaign against the Red Army were not separate projects. One required the other. The chessboard was sitting on something, and the men playing on it knew what was underneath. After the war, Manstein gave testimony at the Nuremberg trials and prepared materials that, together with lost victories, helped construct what historians would call the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. The idea that the German armed forces were professional soldiers untouched by ideology, victimized by an amateur dictator who overrode their judgment at every critical turn. As historian Volker Berghahn observed, the memoir's title gave the argument away. It had been Hitler's interference, not the general's complicity, that cost Germany its victory. Manstein was tried for war crimes at Nuremberg. He was convicted. He served 4 years before being released on health grounds. Winston Churchill helped raise money for his legal defense. He died in 1973. His reputation carefully tended by a book that 3 decades of subsequent scholarship has systematically dismantled. The Kharkov counteroffensive stabilized the southern front. In the spring of 1943, for the first time since Stalingrad, the line held. The genius was real. The victory was real. It lasted 4 months. And the very success of the Kharkov operation had created a problem that Manstein could see on any map. Stavka, rushing reserves south to halt his advance, had produced a large westward-facing bulge in the Soviet line, centered on the city of Kursk. The geometry of that bulge was an invitation no one in the Wehrmacht could ignore. Manstein argued for an immediate strike, before the salient could be reinforced and fortified. Hitler chose to wait, then chose the direct pincer attack from north and south. Operation Citadel launched on July 5, 1943. By that point, Soviet intelligence already knew the timing and location of the thrust. The Red Army had used the months of delay to construct the most elaborate defensive system in the history of land warfare. entirely oriented to defeat exactly the attack that was coming. The Germans were outnumbered nearly 3-1. Manstein's objections were on the record. The outcome was on the record. Citadel was the last German strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Everything after was retreat. Manstein was dismissed in March 1944. He never held another command. He was taken prisoner by the British in August 1945. On August 22, 1943, 5 months after the SS flag had been raised above its ruins, Soviet forces retook Kharkov for the final time. The city had changed hands 4 times during the war. Every German recapture cost men that could not be replaced. Every Soviet recapture undid what the German recapture had bought. The 4,300 SS dead of March and the tens of thousands of Soviet dead in the weeks around them bought the city for 1 summer. The flag Walter's men raised in March was gone before the harvest. Kharkov was rebuilt after the war. It grew into one of the largest cities in Soviet Ukraine and then an independent Ukraine. The operational brilliance Manstein deployed to take it is preserved in military memoirs and history books around the world. The order he signed in November 1941 is preserved in archives. The diary Sergeant Salzberg kept is preserved in a trophy collection in Moscow. Each document describes the same war. None of them contradict the others. What Manstein's victory was for, what it bought, who paid for it, and what it ultimately changed is a question that outlasted every soldier on both sides who was there to answer it. The Canadians, who faced their own version of overextended supply lines and overconfident intelligence in their own operations, drew lessons from exactly this kind of collapse. Lessons about what not to do and how not to assume an enemy's defeat before it is confirmed on the ground. The war ended the same way it was always going to end. And in August, the city changed hands one final time. Nothing strategic was altered, and the long retreat to Berlin began.